most people, it's kind of crazy, but they don't understand what it means to understand something. And so any kind of new thing, it just kind of seems like magic to them. And so I think that's an important thing with education, just giving kids the confidence when someone's like, oh, that's too hard, that you can be like, yeah, try me, because I understand linear algebra and calculus pretty well. And so I think I can handle whatever it is that's going to be thrown at me.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Chrisman Frank. Chrisman is the co-founder and CEO of Synthesis, an online game-based school that was originally built as part of Elon Musk's SpaceX school for his children and children of SpaceX employees. It's now publicly available. They launched in late 2020 to an international user base. And on today's episode, Chrisman and I talk about the origin story of Synthesis and how its founders originally developed game-based learning as a way of teaching kids problem-solving and critical thinking skills. We talk about how Synthesis is utilizing AI to help deliver very personalized tutoring to its students. And we talk about Chrisman's own story going from disgruntled student to math tutor to a member of multiple fast-growing education startups, including his current role at Synthesis. Chrisman has for a long time been one of my favorite education commentators on Twitter. He has very consistently amazing takes, and it was a delight to get to talk to him on the podcast. I hope you enjoy listening. As a quick reminder, if you're enjoying the show and if you enjoy this episode, please like the show and this episode on YouTube so that more people can find it. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, please leave a 5-star rating of the show so that more people can find it. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you enjoy today's episode. Chrisman, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so stoked for this conversation. You're one of my favorite Twitter critiquers of the public education system. I feel like you always have such great takes that are very aligned with criticisms that I have as well, but not always things I've even put my finger on yet and been able to articulate. Where did this criticism of the education system begin for you?
Well, yeah, thanks for saying that. I not all the things I put out are incredibly well thought out. Sometimes kind of shooting from the hip. But I think I always tell people, like, I had this school is just like torture for me, just like absolute torture. Pretty much the whole way through. Even aside from like the bullying and like weird social dynamics that school creates, just the having your mind numbed day after day, and not being able to do what you want, not having any freedom, not being able to sleep because it starts too early, those kind of things. It just felt like prison and like torture to me. And, so I guess I've been critiquing it sort of my whole life since about fourth grade. I was just telling someone recently, like in first grade, I got Citizen of the Year award. So it's like the best boy in the whole first grade. And it was sort of like all downhill from there. so basically did not had a very hard time following the rules and doing what was asked of me after that. And so yeah, I guess just been doing that my whole life, and this experience is so bad that I sort of decided to dedicate my life to trying to make it better or free kids from that in some way. I homeschool my own kids. So it's something that was, I guess, just like a uniquely bad experience. It just felt like something that needs to be fixed in the world. So I've been thinking about it for a long time, and reading and writing about it for a long time.
Do you think that you were particularly attuned to how much like a prison and how much like a punishment it felt to be in school?
I think so. I think I just like, to me, that just things that like don't make sense are somewhat like intolerable. When people are just like, oh, we're just doing this because this is what you do. That's intolerable to me. I think that's just like a personality trait. So yeah, I think I was particularly attuned to it. I think people should be more attuned to it. Like I think this is something my co-founder Josh, who's the one that started the school at SpaceX, Elon. One of the things we really connected on was like just the abuse of kids' time. Like nobody respects kids' time, and in some sense, this is where like it's a relic of the kind of industrial. People talk about the education system being an industrial system, like it's modeled on a factory, but like in her outruns and there's like bells and you switch classes and things like that. Um, but maybe the more important thing about the industrial revolution in terms of education is that you had the schools like daycare where it's meant to take up time, right? Because the parents are going to go do a job for hours and hours a day, and the kids aren't going to be able to help in the factory jobs. And so you have this thing where it's the education is sort of defined by how much time it needs to take up, and that has resulted in this just sort of like abuse of time, or just waste kids' time, and that's the way it felt to me, like just this incredible waste of time. And now I see with my own kids, they're homeschooled, and our kind of philosophy of homeschooling is like let's build skills. We can build whatever skills we want, but education is just skill acquisition. So let's try to acquire, let's spend our time acquiring skills that are either worthwhile, like they're going to come in handy in the future, knowing math and reading and those sorts of things, or they're just pleasurable now as an end in themselves, which is pretty good mirror for adult life. Like you need to do things that are going to be practically useful, but then life is about more than being practically useful as well. And sometimes it's fun to acquire skills. Just mastery is fun in and of itself. And yeah, so anyway, I think being attuned to that just like waste of time, and still that's how we try to run Synthesis. Like we want to be, if you're spending time, your kids are spending time on Synthesis, we want to make the most of the time. We don't want to just keep them there. This idea you can compress the kind of education, like the academics portion of the day, and leave room for childhood and other things that have kind of been lost in modern education.
It wastes so much of kids' time. I hear so many homeschooling families say this, and this was true for me too until I hit high school. And I was such a nerd that I wanted to spend all day listening to recorded lectures and reading books. But prior to that, school really only took a couple of hours a day, tops. And that's true for so many homeschoolers. It's so inefficient. But
Yeah,
the
yeah,
torturousness of it is also, it crushes kids' desire to build skills because they
yes,
associate it so much with coercion and just
yes,
unpleasantness that they no longer want to do the things that they're
yes.
hardwired to do, but also that they need to do in order to be competent,
It
evolving
it
adults.
it does almost seem designed to crush the spirit, right? There's an interesting thing I heard about propaganda that you're not supposed to believe it. Like it's better if it's a lie, because being forced to accept obvious untruths is demoralizing, and that's the point of it. It's not so that people believe it. And I almost think like that almost like has to be something of what's going on in schools. Almost if you're trying to crush the spirit and make people incurious and just stamp out critical thinking. Like, what better system could you come up with than what we have? So I don't know that I'm not necessarily saying there's a conspiracy, but it is just interesting to think like it's kind of hard to imagine a worse way to do it than what we have, because anything that was obviously worse, there would be a rebellion against it. So it's kind of got this like cover of like, oh, this stuff will come in useful, so it's worth kind of torturing kids to learn these things. And it kind of like gets a pass in society. And I don't know why. I think the more you look at it, the worse it seems.
Well, when you go back and you read some of the literature from the founding of the education system and some of the philosophical writings of the people who were the masterminds behind it,
Right.
it's pretty horrible in terms of just like the blatant expression of the benefit of quashing creativity and building everything around the goal of conformity. Is it's all there in black and white. They weren't really hiding it. I don't think it's conspiratorial to say that it's by design. Did you immediately graduate and begin working in education? I know about some of your earlier education projects, but I don't actually know about the early part of your career. How did you end up working in this field?
Um, I went to college in Virginia at Virginia Tech, and I finished in that summer. I think I was, was at a party or something, and I was like, I bet I could ride my bike across the whole country. And someone was like, you no, you definitely can't do that. I was like, well, now I'm gonna do it. I just thought like with it's if I just wake up and pedal a little bit more each day, like eventually I'll make it. So I did that, which was a fun little adventure. I rode from Virginia to California. Then I rode to San Francisco. I moved down to San Diego. I started a business doing making sandwiches. Like we had like a commercial kitchen, and then just did delivery to like office workers in San Diego. And it was somewhat successful. It was enough to like pay me a salary and get by, and buy surfboards for me and that kind of thing. But I ended up realizing I was paying a lot of money to like our web designers. And I was like, I'm just in the wrong career. These sandwiches, I have to keep making them every day. The web designers, they seem to be making a lot more money than I am. So I should get into this technology thing. So I sold that business and moved to San Francisco. And I was looking for work, and I was looking on Craigslist, and there were these, the pay for tutors, math tutors per hour was like more than you could get anywhere else. So I got a job as a math tutor. I ended up working for the company in their corporate headquarters. I taught myself how to make software, and I made software that automated their back end operations. And from there, then I ended up starting my own tutoring company that tutored students online. I got accepted into Magic K-12, which is like Y Combinator for education. It since became just merged into Y Combinator. And through that, my tutoring company wasn't a huge success. Again, it was kind of like decent small business enough to pay me and the other co-founders. But I ended up joining Class Dojo, which is like a messaging app for teachers and parents, which had like a couple thousand users when I joined, and grew to 50 million users. So it was quite successful. It was like an ed tech unicorn. And that is kind of how I met Josh at the SpaceX school. So as part of Class Dojo, I'd go visit all these schools and just kind of see what was the cutting edge in education. I visited SpaceX and saw what Elon and Josh had created. And I visited all these schools, fancy private schools, charter schools, but regular public schools, everything. And I was just kind of preparing to not be impressed, because I hadn't really seen anything that was super impressive. But I was really blown away by the SpaceX school. They were doing something that was like fundamentally different, something that I wanted for my own kids. And my oldest son was like 3 at the time. And I just had this stomach sinking feeling that like like if I don't get him this kind of education, he's just going to be at a huge disadvantage compared to these kids. Kids just seem so bright, and thoughtful, and articulate. And so that led eventually to creating Synthesis, which is basically the idea is scale up the best parts of that school, so you don't have to be a billionaire with your own rocket company to get the best education, and kind of use the power of the internet to make that possible. So that's me in a nutshell.
I've heard you all at Synthesis talk a little bit about the origin story of how Josh came to work for Elon building this school, that Elon had his kids at a school where Josh was teaching. He wasn't
Right.
happy with it. He said, hey, let's go start a school for my kids and for some of the employees at SpaceX, which if I understand correctly, it was really
Yeah.
hard to get into, even if you were an engineer at SpaceX. It was a pretty exclusive.
Yeah, it was 35 kids, and so SpaceX, thousands of employees in LA at the time, and the rest of the city also kind of wanted to get their kids in. So yeah, it was super super small, and they were selecting for traits that I think are kind of like they're kind of selecting for like the people that you would bet on. Warren
Mhm.
Buffett has this idea to ask college students, like, if you could take 10% of one of your classmates' income, like who would it be? And it's like probably not the one with the highest grades, right? Like you're looking at some kind of other things, kind of problem solving ability and resourcefulness and initiative. And so they're kind of selecting for that. And then so they built this like, incredible student body, and then incredible curriculum on top of that to kind of produce capable problem solvers. That was Elon's primary things. Like education is, you need to learn to solve problems. That's not like workbook problems, but actual problems. Like how do we colonize Mars? And for that, you need something a little bit different than what the system produces.
Can you talk a little bit about the origin story of the original Synthesis curriculum? Because I'm
Yeah.
imagining it was like a very first principles, bottom up, like let's figure out how to create something pretty wildly different from what
Yeah.
students were doing in their much more traditional school prior to moving over to Elon's new school.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so it's like again, it's like Elon's got the first principles. You should learn how to think in terms of solving problems. And Josh kind of started with thinking about this more and more. So Josh would go, he'd meet with Elon on Sundays typically, right? Elon pretty busy. So he'd get in like Sunday mornings and just kind of have to sit in the house and like wait for while Elon was like doing other phone calls and meetings and that kind of thing. So you get to hear Elon like running the company a lot and the decisions that he's making and the questions that he's asking of the employees and executives and that kind of thing. So he's got this one hand this directive from Elon of like make a school for problem solvers, and then he's getting to observe like the world's best problem solver up close and like see what that looks like. And so this all kind of goes to informing what he was doing. So there was an early iteration of synthesis, which was like he'd ask the kids a question like, how, where SpaceX wants to move headquarters from LA to Brownsville, Texas. Like how? And then they would just kind of have to come up with a plan for that. And that was pretty good. It was pretty engaging. Kids kind of gained a lot of knowledge through doing that. But at the end of it, they sort of submit a plan, and it's like, okay, you get a B or whatever, right? Like it's like just not. It's kind of like there's no feedback from the environment like there is for solving real problems. And so what he did next is he started kind of just drawing out these like board games effectively, and you make them pretty complex, so the more complex than like a traditional board game, kind of more information to deal with up front, and you'd only get to play them once. So there was kind of this, which is the way that life problems are, right? For the most part, right? Like it's hard to be successful being like the world's best Monopoly player. The world like rewards people who can understand the nature of the game they're playing more quickly, and real games are just more broad like that. So you'd design these games where you'd only get to play them once. You'd have to figure out how the game worked at the same time you're playing it, at the same time you're kind of strategizing, and you'd be on a team with your classmates and you'd be playing against teams of your other classmates. And so there wasn't like a grade anymore. It was like, did you win the game or not? And so the kids would kind of have that responsibility. It made it like really fun and really engaging. And then he just started kind of building more and more levels to the games as you do. So once they'd play through it once, the kids would want to play again. He'd be like, okay, let me tweak some things and help you move on to the next level. And this is a part of what they were doing at SpaceX, but it was the most popular class there. They kind of had one-on-one tutors to teach all the basics like computer science, biology, math and science and that sort of things. And so the kids got to really great levels at those things. And then you just started to think, what's going to hold them back? What's going to be the bottleneck if you learn all the hard skills, to such a high degree at a young age? Well, it's these kind of like problem solving as a team, like the interpersonal skills, the communication, the critical thinking that goes into that. And you get this feedback from the games and through winning or losing to other teams. So you naturally have to kind of go through that process of adapting to the real world feedback and improving how you think and how you communicate. And so the way that we try to design these games at Synthesis is, you try to make it so that the game knowledge itself, it's not about like mastering any one of the games. It's about mastering these meta skills. So we try to design them so that if you don't communicate and if you don't think critically about what's happening, then you will lose the game. And if you do those things well, then you'll win. You'll be able to level up and that sort of thing. And so it just makes the kids naturally, like we don't give them we give them kind of light coaching, but the coaching is just kind of help them reflect on basically one of the top questions we asked is like, what are the course corrections, right? You lost, what happened? What are the course corrections? That's the question Josh got from Elon. He's always hear him asking the executives that question. He'd always assume that you were in error in some way, because that's true, like we always are. And so not like, are there course corrections, but what are they? Just jump right to like, what are the mistakes that you made and how do we correct those? And so that's what we do. We just make this environment. So it's kind of like Montessori at nature. There's an environment that's prepared for the kids. It's meant to draw out these certain things. And then there are coaches there, but they're mostly just sitting back and watching. And they're just occasionally like giving some prompts and that sort of thing. They're kind of there for accountability and just warmth. And, it does help to kind of keep things on track to just have an adult observer there. But they're pretty light touch. And most of the work is being done by the environment, the curriculum and the kids themselves.
How many of these games existed inside of Elon's school versus things that you've continued to build after. Well, actually, maybe we should talk first about how this went from being just private school in LA where you can
Yeah,
only have 35 kids to something that's now like an internet phenomenon where I talk to homeschoolers all the time. They're like, oh, yeah, synthesis. And
cool.
then we'll talk about the games.
Yeah, yeah. That's a really good question. I don't know because Josh was sort of constantly. He's just like this, he's really brilliant, like creative kind of genius. He's constantly doing these things and just creating quick games and then throwing them out and like building something different. So I think at the time that there were maybe like five or six that he kind of kept around and was using for like the new students when they would kind of keep using. And so I have no idea how many prototypes he'd kind of thrown away as a part of that. But he had five or six, and they were all they're fairly simple. It had to be kind of things that he could keep track of with spreadsheets. He didn't have software at the time, so he'd kind of keep track of the moves or the scores in terms of spreadsheets and that sort of thing. So maybe like five or six, and we're about the same now at Synthesis. I think we've gone through, we've made a lot more games than that, but we throw away a lot of them, and we just keep the ones that are producing. We call it conjecture and criticism, which is an idea from pretty adapted from Karl Popper, but made popular more recently by the physicist David Deutsch. So the idea is that knowledge comes from conjectures, which are just guesses, and then criticisms of those guesses, which are then in turn new guesses, new conjectures. And so we're trying to produce games that produce that quality conjecture and criticism, which maybe most people just refer to as like critical thinking. And so it's kind of like group critical thinking. You sort of think of that as like the fundamental unit of human progress. To the extent that we can solve problems in groups by critical thinking together, that's sort of how you're going to colonize Mars or get sustainable transport. We're trying to design games that uniquely bring that out. So we're not like making shooters where the only communication, the only conjecture is going to be like, hey, go shoot that guy over there. There's much more deeper kind of data and trade-offs that you have to think carefully about and try to make more complex predictions about the future. And so anyway, that's kind of like our design principles. The second part of your question, how do we go from the school for 35 kids? As soon as I went down there, I was like, Josh, we have to get this out, especially the synthesis class. We have to figure out how to get this to more people. And he's running the school for Elon, and it was pretty intense. I was working at Class Dojo, and things are growing really fast there. So the timing just didn't feel right. And then around the time COVID hit and kind of let everybody out of school, Elon's kids graduated from the SpaceX school, and Dojo was coming to a place where it was a good time for me to exit. And so we just ended up kind of thinking, well, probably now or never, right? Because you have this environment where everybody's kind of like locked up at home and looking for things. So it was, we knew that wouldn't last probably, but it'd be a good kind of spark to get things started. And we also observed, there was this huge sea change in public attitudes toward education because a lot of people were seeing what happened, just the pedagogical methods of normal schools, and just kind of that collapse in trust in the system we thought would not go away, that was a genie that wouldn't go back in the bottle. So it would be a tailwind that we would have, that this falling trust in the system. Nobody, even if you're in like a really expensive private school, is trusting those institutions anymore. And so that was a kind of a gap that we could fill with like a new institution.
When you made the pivot from the SpaceX school to Synthesis as it now exists, did you have any infrastructure that was already built to have these games be virtual, or did you guys have to go through a super heavy lift to both rethink the actual curriculum, like how much of this actually works in a virtual environment, and then to actually build the infrastructure that you needed? What did that look like? Because you launched pretty quickly. You, like, by the end of 2020, you guys were live.
Yeah, by the end of 20, I mean, we did the first prototype, was testing with like my kids in June. And my brother is a software engineer, and he kind of worked like nights and weekends from his job, like helping us build that first prototype. And it was just kind of a direct translation from one of the games they were doing at the school. But then as soon as you got it in software, you just started realizing there are lots of opportunities to change things up. You could make it work a little bit faster. There's a ton of different things that you could do. So it's kind of started taking on a life of its own as soon as we got that first prototype in. The biggest thing that was a challenge was Zoom. So initially we were on Zoom, so you had to kind of have Zoom for the video and audio part of the call, and then you had to have a separate browser running the game, which was a disaster. But we scaled to, I think, like 5 million in revenue just with that setup before we built our own kind of integrated audio, video, and gaming platform. So yeah, it just launched quickly. The demand was probably a little bit more than we expected, and probably grew a little bit too quickly with like bad infrastructure, and then it was just a huge headache to build something new on the fly and transition to that. But all this worked out well in the end. We have this really cool. We have our own platform now, which now is like with ChatGPT and the growth of these sort of like AIs that can sort of understand voice and transcribe and understand transcriptions even. That's been like a huge tailwind for us because it's enabled our human coaches to be far more leverage, right? Like it doesn't replace the human coaches, but I'll give you an example. We used to send follow-up emails, individual tailored emails to the parents after the sessions, telling them kind of like what we observed about their kids and what they're working on and what their kind of next steps in growth are. And, it's like one person could write 5 of those, in an hour. And even that was kind of a lot. And now like one person can do 100 of them because the GPT gets it pretty close. And then they just have to go through and be like, did I agree with that? And like tweak a few things. So that's been like a huge boon for us, building the kind of infrastructure. And I think that just continues to get better. I think it's like one of those things where online education is just going to be, apart from things that absolutely must be done in person, sports or like putting on a play or something like that. The internet is just going to be much, much better, at education, in terms of like the getting information and like knowledge into people's heads. It's just going to be far better. The only things I think that are going to be done in person in the future are the things that you just absolutely cannot do on the internet, because we still are on this like exponential ramp of internet improving things. And so I think we'll just have, it's not going to be like one of the criticism people have is like, I don't want my kids like on a screen all day. Or like, neither do we. I think in like an hour, if you really use that hour, you can accomplish a lot. And then you have the rest of the day to do, whatever you want.
Today's episode is brought to you by the John Galt Mortgage Company. I am not currently in the market for a house, but when I am, I will absolutely be working with the John Galt Mortgage Company, which was started by my friends Mitch and Tim earlier this year. Mitch and Tim have been working in the real estate world for years, and they realized over time that mortgages are way more expensive than they need to be. Most real estate agents don't even realize how much extra profit is baked into the cost. So Mitch and Tim decided to build a new kind of mortgage, one where they voluntarily cap their own profit on every transaction and pass the savings along to you, the buyer, in the form of a lower interest rate. When I'm buying a house, I will absolutely be working with them. And if you're in the market for a house, you should too. You can find more about what they're doing at johngaltmortgage.com, or you can find a link to their site down in the show notes. Okay, back to the show. One of the models that I'm really excited about is the sort of merging of the hyperlocal with the internet. So some of like the micro schools and learning centers that you're seeing emerge that are taking care of the child care component that has to be in person, but they're outsourcing a lot of the academic instruction to the internet, where, I mean, if you can have the best teacher in the world on a particular topic, why wouldn't you do that, as opposed to learning from whoever happens to be in the business of teaching this thing, who's in like a 10-mile radius of where you live?
That's
like,
what I always say. I don't know if you got that from me or I got that from you, but I always say that like, what kind of person, my generation of parents now like grew up with the internet, right? We had like Amazon when we were kids, and so you're just used to getting the best things on the internet. And like, how are you going to trust your kid's education to just whoever is the best person that happens to live within a 20-mile radius of that school, right? That's crazy. So yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that these like micro schools become what I would like to do is, we have the Synthesis tutor and we have the Teams product now, and we'll build more products to kind of cover and things that can be done on the internet much better. But what I love is the idea of like Synthesis powering these kind of micro schools, and then just creativity at the local level. I'll give you an example. Like I live by the beach here in California. So we have these school programs that are like go to the beach and go discover kind of the ecosystems and wildlife, and like go to different beaches. Whereas you can't do something like that if you're in Texas. There's something else to do. And so I love this idea of just, there is this like core base of knowledge that can be delivered through the internet, and then hopefully, kind of boundless creativity at the local level. So this should enable more creativity in teaching and like running education, rather than less. There'll be this kind of core that everybody needs to know. Everybody should learn math. I think there's broad agreement on that. But then outside of that, people will not agree on. Everybody has their own pet thing where they're like, every kid should learn this. Every kid should take improv, right? And it's like, let those decisions be made locally. Let people argue about those things, and just let it, a thousand different models flower.
Well, first of all, it speaks to how entrenched the public education, the institution of education is, that everything else has migrated onto the internet and we expect it to be. And yet we don't even question that school still needs to be delivered institutionally and at a local level.
Yeah.
But I often think about the public education system as we know it as being like a very historically finite, like a finite in terms of appropriateness for the world that we live in. Like whether or not it was a good institution in the 20th century is also highly debatable. I would argue not really, but it made more sense with
Right.
where we were in terms of the evolution of technology in the world. Like you couldn't have an instructor working on a national scale teaching all the kids interested in their topic because they're just the best in the country at it or the best in the world. But you can now, so you don't need the localization of information anymore. You don't need the physical geographic hub.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when you don't need like, geography at scale, you don't need, every resource from the 5 local towns all pooled together so you can find the best teacher for more niche subjects. Like, okay, your kid really wants to study chemistry. Maybe there's not a great chemistry teacher in your town, but there's one in the next town over. So you have a consolidated school district so you can kind of pool these resources. You can
Right.
get back
Yeah.
to the super hyper local in terms of
Right.
people actually caring about the kids in their community, while the scale of the resources the child has access to continues to expand. And I think that what you guys are doing is a
Mhm.
really interesting front runner of that expansion.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good way to put it. I actually hadn't thought about that. Like that's part of the reason for like these giant district schools is to get more specialists. A bigger institution is better, but the internet kind of takes care of the specialist for you. There may be another bigger driving force in America for those district schools, which is the just sports, right? That may be, but especially in Texas, that may be about actually just getting a better football team, which that may
Also
be
true.
one kind of force that keeps the system in place. Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting way to think about it. I think the first thing you said, like that it's historically finite, is that always helps give me a little bit of optimism. Like the system, kind of as we know it, is like about 100 years old, um, and certainly was not. It's not been in its current form even 100 years, and so it's sort of a historical anomaly, and it'll go away at some point. It just, if you project far enough into the future, 50 years from now, I think kids are going to be not learning. A lot of these things are going to change. They're not going to learn the way that they do now, and so but it is up to us. People have agency, so people like you are kind of like educating parents about it, and just it creates market for services like Synthesis, when people just realize kind of how dissatisfied they ought to be from what's going on in the current system. And so it'll change, and I think hopefully we can just build a small piece of that change, and accelerate things. 'Cause like I said, I think it's prison for. millions and millions of kids. I think it's like effectively prison, and it makes me sad to think about it too much. So the more kids we can free from that, the better.
It makes me sad too. That's why I sit at my computer or my phone every day and tweet about it. Because man, if you can free and any kid that you can free is such a huge win.
It's great
Um,
when we hear from people that made the leap and they start homeschooling or they just do something different. My kids are in this like homeschool charter, so it's not you kind of like homeschool a couple days a week, but then you send them to this place where there's socialization and that sort of thing. And man, it's great. Like you just see one family that they're like, my kid's so much happier now. They're just like so much happier. We're getting the schooling in less time. Like our family is closer, and just like yes, like that's amazing. That's amazing. Just one story like that is fantastic, and hopefully that's going to be true for more and more people in the coming years.
you had such fortuitous timing with the launch of Synthesis as a publicly available product because of COVID. Can you talk a little bit about what you saw in the wave of both dissent against the public school system, but also people looking for options? Because a lot of schools had a really big spike during COVID and then sort of like dropped off a little bit and then either plateaued or started growing again. But there was a really distinct spike in the growth of almost every organization I've talked to during
Right, right.
COVID. What did you notice when you were launching, and how has that momentum carried since the pandemic sort of faded out and most people went back to the old ways of how they were schooling their kids?
Yeah, I think, like I said earlier, they're part of the genie that just doesn't go back in the bottle. It's like I think people have this kind of underlying understanding now that like, oh, what we're doing in the schools is quite bad, and the policies during COVID maybe made you believe that the system doesn't necessarily have the kids' best interest in mind. So that doesn't go away. As far as like COVID spiked, like we didn't really see that because we just kind of launched, and even once COVID ended and everybody was back in school, we're so early, right? So I think it's maybe harder if you're like already at scale, then all of a sudden you're like 5x the size, and then you come back down. But for us, it was you couldn't really tell when COVID ended because just the demand was pretty high for what we were doing, and because we were starting from zero, so we always kind of had a wait list and felt like pretty unlimited demand while we're getting ramped up there. Um, so yeah, it's I think it's kind of like remote work where it's like everybody was working remote and then it came back down, and but there's commercial real estate hasn't really uh come back, and so there's this sort of like I think it's kind of the way these secular trends happen is there's a big spike that's like a bubble, you kind of come back down to reality, but then you just get this kind of steadily ramping growth that takes like years or decades to fully play out. And I think that's where we are now with education after COVID, and same thing with like remote work and maybe a couple other trends like that, where it's this artificial spike, but it kind of just opens your eyes. So it's like everything kind of worked okay, somewhat during the pandemic. So we had a number of parents just experience like, okay, so the school's kind of admitted, like Harvard admitted, it's like you can learn online, right? We're going to do it online, and it's still going to be $50,000 a year. I always think that admission is like that's kind of like under the surface, and like people don't like to talk about it because I think people don't like too much change all at once. But like if you're paying attention, you had these like the kind of most trusted institutions in education just saying like, this is fine. this this works, and so they're trying to kind of maintain the sort of real estate play that they have now, where they can charge a lot of money for the in-person experience, but it's hard to see how they hold on to it when kind of the tacit admission is like, it doesn't really matter. So I think that's going to be a long-term secular trend, and I think it's a huge advantage for your kids if you take advantage of that early, because again, just the odds that you're going to find the best people within a 10-mile radius of your house or so are just not that good. So you'll be able to get the best on the internet. So people who want the best, that the internet is going to increasingly be the place to go.
This also applies to friendships for kids, which is not
Yeah.
always intuitive for people. There's still a lot of stranger danger fear about kids meeting people on the internet. Um, I was a little ahead of the curve when I was growing up, not on purpose, but I was very much, you know, experiencing the things that you're talking about with the like 10-mile radius and even like a 50-mile radius thing, because
Right.
I grew up homeschooled. I was part of homeschool groups that, I grew up in rural Pennsylvania. So we had to drive distances to find groups and people to interact with. And I had a really hard time making good friends. I was social. I could get along with people very easily, but finding people that I really connected with was really hard. And so my best friend in middle and high school was a friend that I met on the internet, and she and I were pen pals. We were email buddies. She lives in England and then Kansas, both of which are very, very far away from Pennsylvania. And so we never even met in person, but we would talk all the time. We would do Skype calls to stay up for New Year's, and we would, spend hours on a Skype call sometime on the weekends, and we'd write chain stories together. And so for me, it was very real that you can find people who share a lot of your niche interests when you're not geographically constrained to whoever happened to be born in your hometown. But what you're doing with Synthesis is really giving kids more space to make these kinds of connections. Can you talk a little bit about what socialization for kids on the internet has looked like inside of Synthesis? And also, like, I imagine you have some hypotheses around how this is going to continue to evolve as more and more of what kids do goes online.
Yeah, yeah. It's a really interesting piece of it. I think that something that I pretty much saw right away is like I don't think parents want their kids entire social life to be online. But I kind of saw this in my own life where I had, because of Twitter, I had kind of like internet friends, a lot of the investors, like employees of the company, people that I know really well. Like when I would meet them for the first time in person, I would be like, "Oh, it's the first time. We never met before," because be surprised by how tall they were or whatever. And I'm like,
Yeah,
"Oh,
you
I
get
did."
thrown off by
I
height and you're like, wait a second. How did
and
I not know that?
it just makes you realize like I've not met you in person before. Like a lot of
Mhm.
people would say that to me, like, "Oh, it's the first time meeting in person." I'm like, "Oh, I didn't know that," right? Like, 'cause it feels, it still feels like you can build friendship. But also I have people, I have friends in like the local community, as well. And so it's just, you get to have these different friend groups, which I think is really cool. And I think that is the case for kids as well. Like my kids have their local friends, and then they have their friends that they've made through Synthesis who maybe live certainly in different parts of the country or in different countries altogether. And they just have two separate kind of groups of friends, which is really really cool. I think it's a more dynamic, kind of exciting childhood than if you're just like strictly limited. And it doesn't have to come at the cost necessarily of having local friends that you can hang out with in person and do things like go play sports or go to the river or whatever the kids do for fun. And so I've seen that play out in my kids' life where they'll talk kind of interchangeably about the kids who are their real life friends and the kids that they've met on Synthesis and are kind of friends with internet only, which is really cool. And of course the ease with which kids make online friendships is just like they are in person. They just will naturally like kind of connect right away, just to bump into people who kind of have similar interests, and then they're immediately like fast friends, which is just a cool thing to see.
What would you say to a parent who is concerned that an online friendship just can't fulfill the socialization and developmental needs of a child? It's just like not the same thing as having a friend you can have an in-person play date with.
I mean, yeah, I think that's probably true, right? Like, maybe right, but I always think that people that really have this tend to fall into this either or thinking, and it's like you can just have both, right? So why not? Your life is going to be richer with more friends, and I think there's plenty of examples. Like I'm one of them. I have lots of people who are basically just internet friends. A lot of times they become real life friends as well. So it's just there's not mutually exclusive. Like we live in a dynamic society, fortunately. So things are changing, and not all those things are bad. So just like anything else, think critically about the change. There's going to be trade-offs, and that's fine. Just think through it for your own situation.
You guys also did such a great job leveraging the internet with the launch of Synthesis at the end of 2020. I remember seeing you everywhere. You guys just exploded. And this was before I was even super deep in the world of education Twitter. Like I was on Twitter, I was paying attention to the education space, but not like I am now, where I'm like actively trying to keep a pulse on it. And I saw you guys all over the place.
Mhm.
I think you had one of the best launches I've ever seen in the education world. And I want to talk a little bit about the approach that you took, because it was very grassroots. It was very, like it almost feels to me like sort of, you talk about institutional education versus a much more bottoms up approach to education. And this feels very much like, even your marketing approach feels very much like institutional media versus just like a real grassroots leveraging the power of the internet that institutions haven't tapped into yet, but that users know exists to get
Yeah.
your product in front of the right people. Can you talk a little bit about what you did?
Yeah, I mean it was sort of obvious to me initially, like people would be curious about Elon school. I mean that was I don't think that controversial. And so we kind of had that story which hadn't been that widely told. Like I didn't really know about the school until I met Josh. Um, so we thought that would be like kind of a hook to get people interested. And it was true to what we were doing. Like Josh had taught at that school for 7 years and developed it and developed the curriculum, and we were doing something that was very similar. So I thought just kind of telling the truth on the internet would attract the right people. Anna Fabrega was she was writing. She'd done like David Perell's writing class and had written a couple essays, and I thought her essays were really good and thoughtful, and her tweets she had some tweets that had gone pretty well. And I think had just like 20,000 followers or something on Twitter at the time. So I'd met her previously talking about something else, and then I invited her to come to Synthesis and check it out. And she'd been a teacher, for a number of years, and she was just blown away by what she saw, the conversations that the kids were having on the Synthesis platform. And we asked her to be the chief evangelist of the company. So just basically the pitch was keep doing what you're doing and writing and talking about education, and like occasionally talk about Synthesis, if it makes sense. And you can do like kind of a launch thread about us where you can just write about it from your perspective, and just publish that on Twitter. And so we kind of did that. That went well. She had a lot of influential followers, which is the cool thing about Twitter. Like you might have 20,000 followers, but you might have some billionaires in that group, or people who are otherwise highly influential. And so that was the case with Anna. So that led to just getting more kind of like people with big followings and some credibility, and sort of this anti-institutional bent, like you mentioned. We don't really go with corporate legacy media. We do everything direct. Doing it that way, by the way, helped us get Balaji Srinivasan, who's a very Twitter famous investor, and he kind of came on because I was like, hey, look, we're following your playbook, right? Like we have a chief evangelist who has their own following, and we just go direct to the audience. We skip the corporate media kind of thing, and like it's working. So that got him on board, which got more people, and just kind of like a snowball effect there. So I think it's a partially strategic and partially like just what we're doing. I think is like fundamentally interesting. I mean, the synthesis class is so fundamentally different, and now with the synthesis tutor, it's fundamentally different than anything people have seen before. So just there's that combination of inherent interestingness along with just the strategy to lean into that, which I don't think takes a genius to see that. I think the hard part is what Josh did, kind of creating that synthesis, that idea of that you could teach this way. And then what the DARPA people did with the synthesis tutor, you got kind of figuring out that these things could work. I think these are like the acts of genius. I think it's pretty obvious. Like if you just have interesting things, talk about them on social media, like that works. The hard part is having something that's interesting.
You mentioned that you really didn't know that Elon's school existed before you went and visited it. Most people had no clue that a SpaceX school was being built. Do you have a sense? Are there lots of schools like that we may start to hear more about, or that might get spun off into products kind of like Synthesis did? Like, are there other places where people who have a lot of money and are interested in education, maybe very selfishly just for their own kids, or like as a perk for people who are working with them, are using their resources to develop things that may later enter the market as more mass available products and offerings? Like, is this going to be a developmental trend in education that people should be watching for?
I think so because I just think like the internet makes it so the good ideas can spread more quickly. So, for example, when I was a kid, I was in a small town. We just had like really kind of crappy restaurants and like entertainment options. Whereas now there's not a whole lot of difference between San Francisco and my little town of like 35,000 people. Like we have a place that sells avocado toast and like craft beer and those kind of things. People can just see those things on Instagram and be like, oh, people here would like this as well. I think that'd be true for education because of work like what you're doing, what our evangelist Anna is doing. I think the good ideas can spread more quickly. And then there's also this funding piece of it with like more school choice bills, kind of that there's that wave taking the red states right now where the funding is kind of getting opened up and unlocked from the system. I suspect that's going to be a really big trend now, which just leads to more kind of creative ideas. And I think my sense is that those can spread more quickly as well. So yeah, I suspect that's going to be a bigger and bigger trend.
So I had Matt Bateman on the podcast over Christmas. We did a Christmas Grinch episode where he was just talking about all the things that were wrong with the education system. It was amazing. But one of his criticisms is that even when people are very financially successful and have tons of resources to throw at a child's education, their spending usually caps out. Like they're not spending tons and tons of money proportional to the rest of their wealth on education, which maybe feels counterintuitive when you think about how important a child's education is for the future of your family and their trajectory. But someone like Elon investing resources into building an entire school and develop a new approach to teaching kids how to think that became Synthesis feels sort of counter to that. Have you seen other things where there's disproportionate amounts of money being spent on education in pockets that may become eventually places where products like Synthesis develop? Do you know of others?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can. I think Alpha is like out there in public now, right? I assume you're familiar with Alpha School.
I am familiar with Alpha School. They've gone super viral on Instagram over the past few months. Mackenzie Price has been posting tons of videos, just like touring the school, and there were a couple of like kids in co-work or in like call booths during the school day that went mega viral, like millions of views.
Very cool. Yeah, yeah. So that's the that I look at that as Alpha is kind of like the successor to to the Elon School, which is just another kind of enormous resources spent on creating the best trying to create the best education possible. And as far as I understand it, the central conceit of Alpha is you spend 2 hours a day like learning the academic stuff so you can master the tests that you have to do. And I'm not sure that how important they view those tests as, but I guess the parents, view it as important to pass the standardized tests and do well in the SAT and that sort of thing. And their kind of idea is like, look, if you do it on the apps, self-guided, takes an hour or two a day, and then you have the rest of the day to spend on life skills. So doing like projects and that kind of thing, as far as I understand it. Which the trick with that is like it's just enormously expensive to do that, to come up with like bespoke projects for kids and kind of enable their projects, because people are kind of limitlessly creative, and so they could come up with anything, and there's kind of no systematic approach to doing that. And maybe they'll come up with one. But yeah, that's one that I know of that I think is like the most interesting. It's basically I know the founder there, and I just say like, basically this is what I would do. I would use software, and they're using a synthesis tutor at the schools as well, and kind of trying to replace the kind of old school apps that are available, but they've kind of had to start it using the apps that were available that were sold into the existing school system, even though they're kind of not ideal. But that's what I would do. I'd use the software piece of it for like an hour or two a day, and then kids could do other things for the rest of the time, and you don't have that, you're not just wasting their time on things that can be done in an hour or two a day. You're not spending like 8 hours a day, along with homework and that sort of thing. So I think that's a really great model. And sounds like they're starting to go, I've known about it for years, but they're starting to come out in public now. And I think it's a really cool model, and I hope, you know, a lot of people kind of see that and try to copy it or do something that's cheaper or better in a different way. But I think they're like really exciting.
How do you think about using games like Synthesis to teach critical thinking as opposed to the classical approach of, you know, read the great works of history and study the evolution of thought and use that as a mechanism to develop critical thought? Do you see them as being related?
Again, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. So it's like you can do a little bit of both. But I sort of think like, what do you we call it in software engineering? There's this idea of bike shedding. It's a concept called bike shedding, and this idea comes from like if you submit plans to an approval committee for a nuclear reactor design, then just kind of sign off immediately. But if you submit plans for a bike shed, it'll be like endless hours of debate because everybody thinks they should have an opinion about the bike shed. They think they kind of like know something about that, whereas there's something there that's sort of beyond their expertise. Then you can just sign off immediately. And so software engineers use this bike shedding thing for like you can just get in these endless discussions that forestall action, and that's not that valuable. And I actually think the way that we try to the way that we teach by like analyzing literature, where you can just go endlessly down these rabbit holes that don't mean anything to anybody. And you kind of what is like the canonical example of that is like the internet commentator, right? We call them like reply guys, right? It's like someone who's like, well, actually on the reply, you know, on some Twitter thread, right? And it's useless. Like nobody wants that. But what people do want are people who can take effective action, which always involves trade-offs, always involves uncertainty. And usually, you know, if you're building a startup or something, any kind of business, there's this time pressure. So it's not like endless debate. Like this is what Josh is kind of rebelling against at the SpaceX school. If I give kids this project idea and I'm like, come up with a plan, then I'm just like grading your plan and it's kind of meaningless. Whereas real life is in the action. So the cool thing about doing this through games or through projects is that you're taking action and you're getting that harsh feedback from reality. So, you know, it's not exactly, I think it's fine to analyze literature or the great works and those sorts of things. And, you know, I enjoy, you know, I enjoy that kind of like food for thought as much as the next person. But I think you can also get over-indexed on that and you know, just kind of spin off into unreality, similarly to how, you know, for most people there's a practical aspect of learning math. Like you can just make better decisions in your life and understand things better through understanding mathematics. But mathematicians just kind of spiral off into these crazy unrealities that don't have any practical import at all. And like, it's fine if people want to do that, but I think it's not what most people want. And I don't think it's like something that we should necessarily inflict on people for educational purposes unless they're interested in it or unless we can find a way to make it beautiful and interesting to them. So that's, yeah, that's my kind of opinion on the, you know, the typical Socratic method. I don't think it's bad. I just think it's I think you can go too far with that. And I think again, you don't want people who just kind of endlessly argue. Like at some point the rubber meets the road and there needs to be action. We want people, if you think about education as the purpose of people who can take effective action, which I think is a good definition, then I don't know how far you go into kind of analyzing old speeches and that kind of thing. Which is controversial. I could probably argue with Matt about that. You know, again, it's like I probably argue with Matt about that for hours and hours and hours, but it's better we can just each do our thing and just take action and see how it turns out.
Starting a new education Twitter movement, E/ACT, effective actionists, is like the goal of education.
Yeah. I think it's funny because it's hard to. It's one of the reasons education is so hard is because society is dynamic. It's always changing. And so you're trying to educate people and it's always going to be unclear. We're always going to kind of fight about the best way to do it because there's fundamentally this uncertainty. And so I think the fighting and like the arguing is fine. It's like always going to be the case. It will always be that way because there's so much uncertainty in it. There is no one right way.
Yeah, it's healthy and it's necessary for the evolution of what education can be. You mentioned earlier that you're using AI to help create emails for parents. You also mentioned a couple of times the AI tutor that you guys are now using. How are you using AI inside of Synthesis? Because you adopted it pretty quickly.
Yeah, well, we were sort of working on something that's it's a descendant of this DARPA project, which they called the digital tutor. So it's kind of, the best way to educate people on like a topic, let's say, to like build some skills with like a one-on-one tutor, right? And so people have known that for centuries. But there's a researcher called Benjamin Bloom who kind of put some data on this in the 80s and found you could take students from 50th to 98th percentile, so 2 sigmas, 2 standard deviations, through one-on-one tutoring, and you couldn't really do it any other way. And tutor, that's the problem, because tutoring is super expensive. And so the holy grail of education, kind of like the cold fusion technology, your full self-driving car, for education is a superhuman digital tutor. And so DARPA actually created this for the Navy. It's a crazy story, but they basically created this for the Navy. They went way beyond 2 sigma. They got 8 standard deviations of improvement in teaching people IT, how to be IT technicians on nuclear submarines. So pretty technically complex job. They were having a very difficult time training people. They built a digital tutor that was far beyond what anybody even imagined possible in terms of the results it was getting in developing these skills. And the crazy part about the story is they just sort of didn't tell anybody about it. So they got these results in 2012. So doing it with technology from 2012 and some kind of in-house things that they developed, and just didn't tell anybody about it. And the company kind of cratered. And then people who worked there kind of came to us and were like, hey, we built this thing. I didn't believe them at first. But the more I got into it, I saw that I thought they were legit. And, so we kind of took what they'd done and kind of stood on the shoulders of giants and tried to create a version of that for kids. And then, of course, along the way, we get this tailwind from the modern AI. We say like we're using AI, but I more like you're using like neural nets. Like I don't believe like really anything close to AI out there yet in terms of the intelligence to solve an unknown problem. So we're still kind of using this like statistical regression, like basically what these programs are doing. But there's really cool effects of it. Like, for example, you can transcribe audio, in real time now, and you can kind of analyze the text and kind of summarize, and you get pretty good results from doing that. So we get the tailwind of that along with the kind of core teaching, technology that DARPA had developed, and you kind of put those things together, and it makes for something that's really engaging and that feels like interacting with a person, and is also a really, really effective teacher. Well, we think we don't have the proof of this yet for the Synthesis version of the tutor, but soon we think we'll be able to announce that this is provably, the world's best teacher, human or machine. And so that's kind of the main, tip of the spear for Synthesis growth now. People kind of find out about the tutor and sign up, and then we tell them about the teams, the thing that came from Elon school, and they'll tend to sign up for both things. And, we'll just keep building that out until we get, pretty full curriculum for what Elon calls like the trunk of the semantic tree of knowledge, right? There are kind of core things that you more or less, an educated person should know. And so we'll kind of build out that core. And then the idea is like people just get up to speed on that very quickly, and then they can go branch off into their own things that they're interested in. We won't necessarily teach everything, but we'll teach that kind of core and make it available at a low cost for, any family in the world or any institution in the world who wants to buy that for their kids.
One of the other big conversations that comes up around AI is how quickly people anticipate it's going to change the nature of work, or at least the types of work that people are doing that require a human versus things that can be outsourced to technology. And there's a lot of conversation around how much more quickly the jobs landscape is going to evolve, and then how to think about preparing kids to enter such an unknown once they graduate. And I mean, even regardless of AI, the job landscape has been changing so rapidly, and that pace has been accelerating. The work that you and I do now didn't exist when we were respectively in school and thinking about what do you want to be when you grow up? How do you think about that with the kids that are coming through synthesis, and also with your own kids? How do you think about preparing them for a work landscape that we really have no idea what it's going to look like?
Yeah, I think that's I mean, it's frankly like terrifying as a parent, right? Because you kind of went through this, like as an entrepreneur, kind of like you're have a lot of risk tolerance, and you're kind of open to finding your path. But yeah, sometimes I think about that too much. It is like really terrifying. Like it's you kind of like you sort of miss like the hunter gatherer, or the farmer days, where you're like, okay, if I teach my kid to farm, then they'll kind of know, they'll have a way to make the way in the world. And I think you could still do that. Like I still think you're gonna have accountants and lawyers and those sorts of occupations, because I think those things are fundamentally actually like creative in their nature. Like every problem is different, and I don't think we really have AGI that can act as an attorney yet, and I don't actually see that we're on the path to that. So you still have kind of these professions that are more or less stable, but certainly that more and more of the world is going toward these creative kind of niches that you have to kind of use your creativity to discover a niche that provides value for people. And it does feel like there's less standardization. You can't go get a job at a factory anymore. There's like less of this, like you can train up for something once and just kind of continuously do it forever, particularly in like the white collar work. So it's a terrifying thing to think about. And I think about it for my kids as like, let's build the skills so that you're upwind of whatever problems there are. Like I think if you build a really good grounding in physics, and you're a really good reader, so you have a lot of knowledge and vocabulary, like those sorts of things are quite likely to be useful. The ability to think critically and think logically using like physics and mathematics and those sorts of things are likely to be useful. And beyond that, you just have to realize like you don't know. So I think trying to get the kids comfortable with uncertainty and having that belief in themselves that they'll kind of get out and take action and sort of through action find what they're meant to be doing. I mean, I think that's the best you could do. And that it's just fundamentally scary too. Like I remember being 20, 25 and just like not knowing how the future would unfold. And I think people who are a little older sometimes like look back on that time with rose-colored glasses. But for me, I look back on it and I'm like, I'm very glad now. Like I have my family, I have my career. Like I know, what I'm going to be doing. I think it's very tough to find those things, when you're younger. So I have a lot of empathy for young people trying to figure it out. But I think ultimately, all you can do is go try things and just take action in the world somehow, and then use that feedback to course correct. So that's why we're going to keep fighting about education, because there is this uncertainty in the world, and there's nothing to be done about it in the end. Just have to embrace it. Try to learn what you think is most likely to be practically useful. Try to teach kids what's most likely to be practically useful, and teach them to go out and find their path. It's hard.
It's hard for sure, especially if you've thought enough about what you want out of life that you're not comfortable just defaulting to a standard path.
Yeah.
But it's also, if you can equip kids with the ability to learn new things and the confidence to, and the desire to, it hasn't been crushed out of them by years and years of coercive learning that have led them to associate learning with effectively torture, you can equip them with the skills that they need to think
right.
iteratively about their path.
Yeah.
And pick up the skills along the way that they need.
Yes, I think that's right. This is partly why we start with math for the synthesis tutor, because I think when you can understand the math, then I think things are just less intimidating for you. Kind of anything else. If you can really understand math and physics, then when you're just not going to be intimidated by whatever the new thing is that you're supposed to learn. Most people, it's kind of crazy, but they don't understand what it means to understand something. And so any kind of new thing, it just kind of seems like magic to them. And I was this way before I really got a deep understanding of of computer programming. Computer programming is what helped me, because it was this very intimidating thing with a bunch of jargon. And once I realized, like, no, you can just understand this from like atoms on up, like how it's working. You don't have to just like type in symbols and hope it works. Like you can actually understand what's going on. That was this breakthrough for me, where it's like, oh, so I can just, there's nothing really that's going to be too complicated for me to understand if I take the time. And so I think that's an important thing with education, just giving kids the confidence when someone's like, oh, that's too hard, that you can be like, yeah, you know, try me, because I understand linear algebra and calculus pretty well. And, you know, so I think I can handle whatever it is that's going to be thrown at me.
If people enjoyed this interview and they want to either learn more from you or learn more about synthesis, where would you send them next?
Probably Twitter is the best place for people who like to read. So I'm at Chrisman Frank on Twitter, and we have at Synthesis School on Twitter as well. So you can just type in at Synthesis and it'll come up.
Highly recommend Chrisman's Twitter. It's full of great takes, including one that we didn't have a chance to talk about, which is your tweet from last night, I think, where you said that kids shouldn't have to learn grammar, or that like learning grammar is an overrated skill inside of the education system, which I think there's a deep grain of truth there, even though it's very triggering for people. There's lots of good content like that on your Twitter. So highly
classical
recommend.
education people, I think, are not going to like me, because for that reason, I think it's sort of, you can justify anything with like, oh, maybe it'll come in handy later. And I think that's what people do. Like I've read whole books about why kids should learn Latin and Greek and grammar. Like I've read entire books about this, and they're just like, they're word cells. It's just words. It's like there's as far as I can tell, like nothing very deep there. Although they can use lots of words to justify it, I don't think any of it rings true to me. But you know, that's the beauty of it, is with more options, people can make their own decisions and decide what's best for their own kids. I wouldn't want to prescribe something for like every kid. I just know for my kids, I'm not going to teach them grammar. People can make of that what they will.
Well, once your child is at a developmental level where they can learn something quickly and they've learned the skill of learning, if they ever need to know grammar, if they need
Right.
to become an editor or describe parts of speech, it doesn't really take that long to pick it up. It's not that complicated.
Yeah, it's
but
hard
it's
when you're like 6
that,
years old, then you don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah, then it's hard, right? Yeah, true.
Yeah, but most of my grammar came from reading, honestly. Like I learned the parts of speech and stuff, but I am a very intuitive editor of my own writing, and it's because I've read so much that I know what something's supposed to sound like.
Yeah, can you clip this soundbite for me or share this with my wife? Because that is like, that's what I've said from the beginning. It's like, don't worry about teaching the kids to write, even just read a lot. And then writing is naturally, because your head is just filled with like good examples and easy to access vocabulary and phrases and that sort of thing. And so
this is a really hot take, but I think it's more important that your kids read really quality books than it is that they get formal instruction in either writing or grammar in terms of like the quality of their output. I think it will do more.
100%. I'd love to study this. This is what I'm going to do if I become a billionaire. I'm gonna do really long-term studies to settle some of these debates. It won't work. It'll just make people argue more, but at least it'll satisfy my own curiosity.
I don't know. I would love to read those studies, honestly.
Yeah, I suspect you're right. What do you think about last? I have a question for you. So my kids, I hear you about quality books. So my kids all learned to read with Dog Man because they would just sit and read Dog Man for hours. And so I kind of let them read, comic books until now my middle one is like 8, and it's starting to be like, okay, let's read some chapter books now. But I was cool having them just read comic books because I just noticed their vocabulary growing and they were consuming lots of words and becoming fluent in reading. And so I hadn't focused on the quality of the books that they read, until a little bit later. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on that approach, or would you be pushing them to read quality from the time they're, 5 or 6?
I mean, I would never force a kid to read anything, because I think you just run the risk of making kids hate reading.
Yeah.
And that's just like, I can't think of a single book that is worth that price, like not even close. I think reading quality books to kids can serve the same functions. If your kids are really excited about something, I mean, I wouldn't let them read things that I looked at. I was like, this is like poorly written, and I don't want I wouldn't be happy if my kids were writing this way. So I would, with my own kids, I'd probably be protective about that, probably in part because my mom really was with my sister and I feel like we really benefited from that. But like if the kids are excited about it and you are happy with them reading it, like let them read whatever they want. I think you can model it for them by reading like really quality chapter books and even like picture books to them that just have like very beautiful language.
Yeah, I did that.
It's building the culture.
That's how I helped them. That's how I got them to level up, because going from like a comic book to like, here's this book that just has, pages, walls of words. And Roald Dahl was like kind of the first one. And I was like, I'll read this to you. And they're like, oh, hate it. And then we read 20 pages in and I'm like, all right, time, that's enough. And then kid's like, give me that. And just grabs it from me and just like blazes through the rest of it. So that was definitely, that was a tactic that
I love that.
Yeah.
It's a really good way to get kids to read on their own once they have the capacity to. Leave them on a cliffhanger, they will become independent readers very quickly. Yeah.
100%. Well, cool. Well, thanks for doing this. It was fun.
Chrisman, this was so much fun. Thank you for doing this. I'll link to all of your Twitter stuff in the show notes so people can find it. Thank you so much for taking the time. This was great.
All right. Yeah. Thanks. Likewise.
All right, my friends, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this valuable. Please leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Please like the video on YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you so much, friends. I will see you next week.